Next up, we have a panel discussion, should be a fiery one. Bias in AI is what everybody is talking about, but how realistic are the mitigation strategies of today? We have a very diverse perspective on the panels. From the panelists, we have an actual professor, Professor Michael Witbrock from University of Auckland and Raluca Crisan, who is the CTO and co-founder of Etiq AI, moderated by our very own leadership council, Susanna Raj. And I'm going to welcome everyone and bring you all on stage.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Michael. Good morning. Hey, Raluca.
Hi. Hi, Susanna. Hi, Sue. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Raluca. Hi,
Michael.
Are you excited about this discussion?
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. All right, Susanna, lead it.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this panel. Today, we are going to discuss about bias mitigation strategies that are being used today and how effective they really are. I'm excited to have an academic perspective on this as well as a business perspective from Raluca, who is the co-founder and CTO of Etiq AI, and Michael, who is from the University of Auckland. I just want to start this with a very basic question, because bias means different things to different people who come from different backgrounds. It means it has a totally different meaning for me as a social science researcher. So I want to start with that basic questions. What does bias mean to you? When you hear the word bias, what does it mean to you? Any one of you can go first.
I guess I'll go first. So I think it means at least two completely different things. And I think this makes it difficult when it's used, right? It can just mean the predisposition in data or in some acting system to act in a particular way, right? So that the data suggests some sort of action, or they suggest some sort of categories that cause the system to behave in a particular way, and that's kind of built into the way the system's produced. Or it can mean the sort of invidious predispositions that some human beings have, which cause them to behave in ways that we would think are undesirable or even evil, right? And these these two things are not exactly the same, but they are used interchangeably and not to our benefit, I think.
Yes, true. And Raluca, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I guess when within the context of, I guess, my work and just the Etiq company, the thing we're kind of referring to is one of those things that it's kind of easy to recognize when you see it, but a little bit hard to define in a kind of standardized way, let's say. So it's basically an outcome of an automated decision system, which is somehow obviously unfair when you kind of think about it. It could be that maybe an overall system performs much worse from an accuracy point of view for a certain group. So it just doesn't seem to work for that group. That's something that we can, if we see it, we say, oh yeah, that's a problem, that's unfair. Or it could be that you have two individuals and they're kind of very similar in all aspects we'd consider important for, getting a loan or whatever, getting a job, but maybe they're different gender or something we don't consider important as humans. And then the system kind of comes up with, a biased decision, something we recognize, oh, it's unfair. Like those people should have the same decision, but they're not, so it's, hard to define, but we kind of can recognize it in its outcome.
And I do think we are all born with our own biases. We have evolved with our own biases. Some of them have protected us, some of them I think we need to get rid of soon, but we are a work in progress, right? So the biases are embedded in our data itself, right? So,
and one of the things which is very interesting about the source of this debate is that as we build systems with the data that human beings have produced, right, they make those biases, whether they're good or bad biases, manifest, right? They allow us to experiment on those biases, right? It's not that the algorithms. So I have got a little bit of a problem with this use of the word algorithmic bias, right? It's not that the algorithms have biases, right? It's the data that maybe the people applying the algorithms have biases. Occasionally, it's at least logically possible that the algorithms have biases based on the way they're developed, but that's almost never what people are talking about. It's the data has been selected that is representative of a human group and possibly all of the humans over some time period, right? And that the decisions now that these systems make reflect those biases and make it clear to us, for example, that in our literature, right, we are teaching ourselves with our literature to have biases which might well be expected to cause humans to discriminate against women, for example, right? And by having computers do this, we can point the finger at them and say, like, bad computer, knowing, I hope, full well that it means that we're bad people too.
Yes. I do agree, and there is this interesting debate going on whether the algorithmic bias starts in the algorithm, or it starts in the people, or it starts in the data. I feel like that's like a chicken and egg discussion that we will continuously have forever. So, what do you think, Raluca, on that note? Let's before we move on to the question.
Yeah. So first, just for sure, there's this kind of approach, let's say, or mindset that it is about the data. And as I said, yeah, for sure, it's definitely a big part of the way things get decided. So, and it's reflecting our biases and so forth. But it can happen like across a variety of things. So, for instance, maybe like as humans, we make some decisions which are biased based on characteristics which are biased. But as an algorithm, I might just be picking up a proxy in a way, right? So it's not something that maybe as a human I would ever recognize to be associated with a certain demographic group, but maybe the algorithm somehow recognizes it, and part of the algorithm using that feature is, maybe it has some real explanatory power beyond the bias, but part of it is the bias. And then which one is which is very hard. It's a very tricky problem to assess. So yes, it's the data for sure, but it's also maybe the nature of the system that is discovering patterns in the data, and then how we interact with that system and how we kind of try to shape it and control it a little bit, so that if we don't want to do certain things, we can affect that essentially.
And I think kind of the fundamental difference there, when you say that a human being would never consider doing this, well, there's always like one always speaks too soon on these matters. Like, human beings can be quite awful, but to the extent that human beings wouldn't manifest the data, the biases, the negative biases in the data that they're learning from. To the extent that's true, it's because we have access to a kind of data that these systems don't have. And ironically, we have access to a source of inductive bias, which these systems don't have, and that source is knowledge, right? Why do we know? Why can we look at the same data? About job outcomes for women or job roles for women, right? Why can we read the same data that GPT-3 reads, right, about suitable jobs for women and men, right, and not reliably produce the same predictions, right? Which across many languages, the same predictions that the engineers will be male and nurses will be female. The data causes that to happen if you make a naive language model, right? Why do we know better than to exhibit those biases, right? We know better because we know better. So we have a piece of knowledge which tells us that we should disregard that sort of information, right, in many decisions, because it will cause unjust actions. And as we move towards computers having access to that kind of knowledge, right, I think that the likelihood is really that quite soon we will be less likely to have decisions based on invidious biases from machines than from people, right? So I think a lot of the problem we're having not all of it, but a lot of the kinds of problems we're having at the moment are very temporary, and they're because of a weakness in our AI systems, and namely the weakness in their inability to use not just data, but knowledge. So that was a little bit long-winded, but yeah.
And no, I think this brings up very well into our next question. If you think it is so complex and it's so embedded in the data itself, where do you think as a solution finder, while we are working on a solution to solve this problem, where do we start then at the development cycle? Where do we start in the AI life cycle? Where do we start this solving this problem from? Are we starting at the wrong place when we look at only algorithms or mitigation strategies, or should we actually start at the data collection or the idea conception stage? So where do you think we should start?
Yeah, I can quickly try to. Yeah, definitely as early as possible. But I think it's kind of better to start. I think with some. Somebody said it's better to start somewhere, right? So I think that would be my first thing. Let's start somewhere, and then we can kind of, at least make some sort of an impact first. But yeah, it's definitely early in the life cycle, and there's just a few things we're noticing from kind of what we're doing. One, it's not about the metrics. We're finding metrics not super helpful. It doesn't seem to be an optimization problem. I think a lot of the literature is heavily kind of around it being an optimization problem, which is natural because this is the world I guess we all live in. But it doesn't follow that the solution can necessarily be solved in this way. So what we're seeing that it's a little bit more effective is like whether it is at the data or pre-data collection stages or like at the output stage, it's around that kind of interpretability layer, that kind of surfacing issues, and then the human can kind of interact with those issues and in a sense trace them back. But just to give you kind of an example, for instance, when we say like a data collection, like let's say you're a company that targets, a certain demographic group that might or might not be, let's say, white male between 35 and 65, and like, a certain like income bracket, like in a certain US state, right? So it's very hard for you to collect data. I mean, your whole product is optimized for this demographic. So when we talk about data collection, like it can lead a company to start asking kind of uncomfortable questions about what it is they're actually doing as part of their business model. Because if your product is for this, then you will collect a certain kind of data. And, so yeah.
True. And what about you, Michael? What do you think?
Well, I think that one of the things that we are missing is any sort of clear agreement or on what these classes of invidious biases are. And instead, we're sort of, from the point of view of people who are building decision support systems, right? I mean, and we're left with sort of a hodgepodge of ideas from different countries. So, New Zealand, where I am, differs quite strongly from some other, from say the United States, in the extent to which it enforces protections against bias against women or against LGBT people, right? And certainly differs very strongly compared to some other countries. So just suppose we're trying to build a system which identifies, for example, whether these proxies are being used, right? You could build a system that looks at your data and sees whether the data has features which can be used as proxies for identifying classes, classes such as I don't know, likely vaccination status, right? Right. So some a health thing which often would be seen as protected, or proxies for things like ethnicity or one's self-described gender, right? So classes like that. Suppose you build a system which is trying to say whether there are things which are used as proxies for that. It would be very useful to know what sort of things we should build in sort of required checks for proxies, right? So it turns out, it seems, based on a probably to be found out to be bogus study, that your astrological sign predicts your vaccination status in the United States. There was a news story about that just today. I hope we find out that that's not true. It was a 46% versus 70%, right? So if it is true, your posterior probability that there's something to astrology would be higher. So one assumes that's not true. Suppose that was true, and you could kind of predict birth month, right, from vaccination status. Should we build into systems attempts to detect that, right? Attempts to predict the month or the gender, and only if they can't predict that using these sorts of proxies should we allow them to go forward. Only by starting to have a discussion about what the industry standards should be for testing these things, irrespective of what the particular country standards are, will we, I think, be able to make progress using the techniques that we've got available to us at the moment.
Raluca, I would like to say my opinion on this. I think proxies, by their their existence itself, actually stand for societal biases. I mean, all our proxies have a bias built in, and that bias comes from prejudice and historical discriminations are built into those proxies. So that's what I think. So I believe, like, even using a proxy for for crime prevention or for anything else, we have to look at the knowledge behind it. How did we come to know this proxy is a good stand-in for that classifier? So to me, that itself is a dangerous zone to go into. But what do you think, Raluca? You are actually in the industry itself, working on solving this problem. So I would like to hear your opinion on using proxies and what I know Michael was saying so far.
Yes, I mean, obviously it's hard to generalize, but I would say that whether intendedly or not, it does happen that people use this. But of course, a proxy is never usually a perfect proxy, right? So it's a very gray area. But if how should I put it? The problem is when people are not even aware, like, or not even looking at this topic at all. I'd say that's that's a starting point, like, of a problem. So if they at least have some understanding that their models might impact kind of actual people, like, in negative ways, then at least they can start looking at it and treating it with a certain degree of caution. I think even before that, there's a step that needs to be undertaken. And to my mind, I'm not sure if this answers the question, but we see a lot of it's something very hard to regulate, right? So first of all, what's the threshold for? How would you define? I mean, there's like a billion, like a few ways to calculate, like, basic metrics, just a basic metric, a few ways to calculate. So how it's very hard to regulate as such, because you wouldn't be able to define it in a standardized way. But if you look at the data, you look at the model, look at the outcomes, you can kind of pick up if something is wrong. Is, I guess, and you should be looking at this and picking up if it's wrong, right? So this is, I think, the dubious area where I think, and I'm not sure if I'm right, but if the people that are working on this are starting to kind of look into it a little bit more, then they will at least try to manage within their applied use case to make the decision less problematic. But if there's a regulator, so they will be able to, well, actually, income is a proxy for financing. However, I will, it's a kind of general decision that I will use this. But, whether I shop with a certain brand at a certain time of day, maybe that I shouldn't use this as a decision as whether I finance someone or not, because actually it's a proxy for something that maybe can be a demographic group, right? So these are things that happen. Or there are examples like the example is clearly wrong, but if you don't even look for it, if you don't even look for these instances, then you're never going to find them, because you think it's all good. So
but this case with income versus ethnicity or gender, which that's an interesting case, because it's it could those could show up as proxies in both directions, right? And
yes.
the reason they're a proxy is that they're actually causally related, right? People of certain ethnicities or certain genders have lower incomes because of discrimination, right? This isn't an accident. So I'm not. So one could argue, for example, that by removing knowledge of the effect of gender on income, right, from your system, you're in fact likely to be preserving discrimination by causing. This is actually related to the affirmative action question, right? You're likely to be perpetrating discrimination by removing the system's ability to notice, right, that this income is dependent on gender, right, and therefore should not be allowed to affect the outcome for somebody. Of course, people have wildly different opinions about this, and their opinion varies wildly depending on which groups they're members of or are not members of, and who this discrimination should be mitigated against. Also varies widely. So
and
this is why this is I mean, it's much easier just to blame the algorithms, right?
But not sure if this is at all helpful. But for instance, in a lot of well, not a lot, but some countries, it's not, you can't use the demographic feature in the model itself. So that's for sure. That's the regulator says no for sure, right? So then what people are using a proxy for it, but then the problem is then they get counterfactuals, right? This is what happens. This is what so either you have no counterfactuals, but your model is pretty bad for a group, or your model is actually great and you have loads of counterfactuals just moving around and potentially creating issues. So I mean, how would someone regulate that or solve for it is kind of
I know some
question mark.
I know
Susanna, we are almost out of time, and we do have some audience questions we would like to answer.
Sure.
We are a little over time, and I would love to take this question. Bias in data, Rakesh Ranjan says, bias in data, at least system of records, if not the system of engagement, may represent the state of bias and prejudice in our own society. So I'm interested in learning how the panelists' perspective on if mitigating bias in data would really solve the root cause.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it can, to be honest, but not like completely remove it. But I think we started at the point at which, humans were pretty biased. We put these statistics in place to notice that humans are pretty biased. And now we're like, the statistics, we're made the statistics more complicated. Now it's like like now we notice bias, but it's kind of reverting back to, let's just leave the human with bias. It's probably not the way to go. So, there's potential for this to make a difference for the good overall, maybe.
Yeah, I think it can certainly mitigate the root cause, if nothing else, by allowing us to build systems which can point out the effect, the causes and the likely effects of human bias, as well as bias in the systems built from human-derived data.
So, Susanna, let's wrap it up with one more question, and then let's wrap it up, okay?
Yeah, sure. I would love to hear. I know Michael is a professor and who is, very much interested in building systems of knowledge as a way of mitigating bias. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that, because that seems to go back into the foundational models of AI and looking at, whether we can use knowledge as a whole, or or as, Raluca pointed out, there are proxies. And then I also wanted to jump in and say that we actually used another proxy for income, which we thought was, marital status and education level as a proxy, but even that led into problems. So where do we cannot even start with proxies anymore, but how do we start with knowledge as a database instead of looking as data?
Yeah. So knowing that something is a proxy for something else, right? And that we can therefore try to build models, causally informed models, which mitigate those biases, right? That is a kind of knowledge, that's a kind of knowledge. What goes into these knowledge structure, what things, we have to be able to use these features because we can't build mitigation systems without them, right? If you can't know that your system will use income as a proxy for gender, for example, right? Then it's impossible to mitigate that effect, right? Because you can't build a causal model which supports the calculation. If you do know that, right? If you do have that knowledge explicitly, and we can automate the process of building that knowledge into our systems, I think we have a chance of greatly reducing the cost of mitigation. If we've got systems which actually use causal inference to find out what things are possible proxies, right, and turn them into knowledge, then we have a likelihood of being able to build systems which are far better at this than we humans are. And I think that's a very hopeful point of view. And there is a movement at the moment from being data-centric to being data and knowledge centric. People have been saying that data is the new oil, and I'd say that that's exactly right, right? And it's something that you use when you're a lot when your technology is primitive, but it's not really all that good for the world, right? And that knowledge-based systems are the new wind and solar, and we should move towards them as soon as possible, and particularly systems which have explicit knowledge about what the right thing to do is.
Awesome. Do you have any final thoughts on that, Raluca, before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, causality is a great area. Yeah, we'd love to see more industry kind of looking at it in a serious way. Like, not necessarily, I mean, people are looking at it in a very serious way, but I mean, kind of looking at it more for these purposes. But yeah, what else? Definitely, I think while we have a more practical approach, it's kind of the people that build the system that are super important, right? So not because they're the only important ones. I mean, it'd be great to get the consumer somehow to contribute to the systems, but I mean, we're not kind of there yet. But if we get people want to build better systems, like especially like people who build stuff, they want to build better stuff, right? So that's not a problem. So I think it's just a question of giving them some tools like research and so forth that they can actually do that easily, basically.
Thank you both of you, and I really enjoyed this discussion on and especially that data is the new oil or the oil, the new electricity. I think those are all that actually the answer is in the sentence itself. Like Michael pointed out, we are supposed to use them only for a limited period of time until we find something better, and that better could be a global repository of knowledge, of understanding of cultures and languages and everything together. That is where we need to be moving towards, even though that's a harder problem. But I think the industry as a whole needs to invest in it and move towards that. With that, I would like to wrap up and give the stage back to Shilpi. And thank you both, Michael and Raluca, for coming on this show.
Yeah, no, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Michael.
Thank
Thanks, Raluca.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.